And so policy questions, I think, many people have suggested it's reasonable to set some limits on when a government scientist can comment on policy. But in some cases, if they're asked a question about are the levels of pollution at a certain level that we need regulations, well, you know, there's a debate about whether you can answer that question, but they were given a script and asked to say, I am a scientist, I cannot comment on policy, you must refer this question to the minister or so-and-so or someone else in my department. So this is the level of control that we've seen in the reporting that we've done in recent years. A number of reporters, and you know, my former colleague Margaret Monroe, our science writer who's based out of Vancouver, has written extensively about a lot of these issues. There was a similar case in Natural Resources Canada, where, again, we found out through access to information legislation about the minister being informed of the research being done in his department linking groundwater contamination to oil sands development. And in this case, we found out, I think it was January 2012, or sorry, 2013, or February 2013, we asked for an interview. To this date, no Natural Resources Canada scientist has, the ones who contributed to this research, none of them have been able to come forward and give an interview. Now, there might be some cases where scientists don't feel comfortable with the media, don't want to give interviews. That can happen, and that might be one of the factors here. But I think one of the things that I have seen in talking to some of the scientists, not on the record, but talking to them behind the scenes when they know they're not going to be quoted, is that the communications policies that have been adopted by the government scare them, and they say that they don't want to give interviews, or they're afraid if they are saying anything that the government doesn't like, what the consequences will be. So I think that was essentially all I wanted to cover. I'm going to turn it over to back to Ethan and Chris and look forward to
Merci beaucoup, Mike. Before we go on, I wanted to share a little quote with you, which I found when I was looking around on the internet today from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's quite in the news these days. He's got a TV show out here. Science is an enterprise that should be cherished as an activity of the free human mind because it transforms who we are, how we live, and it gives us an understanding of our place in the universe. And I thought that was particularly apropos for this evening. Next, we have Chris Turner, the founder of LeapWorks and an author, speaker, and strategist, who provides Canada's most authoritative voice on sustainability and the global clean tech boom. He's a National Business Book Award finalist for The Leap, which the Globe and Mail called one of the most arresting arguments for building a green economy yet in print, and The Geography of Hope. He is also the author of international bestseller Planet Simpson. Lui était une conférencier pour TEDx en 2010 et 2013. Et Turner a été publié en Fast Company, Time, Utne Reader, The Walrus, Canadian Geographic et plusieurs autres publications. His expertise earned him 9 National Magazine Awards. Et comme le candidat pour le Parti vert du Canada en 2012 en Calgary Centre in the by-election, Turner's passion, platform, and personality allowed him to post the best result ever by a Green candidate in Alberta. His latest book, The War on Science, has already been heralded as required reading for all Canadians, and was the joint winner of the Writers' Union of Canada's Freedom to Read Award. When not writing or consulting, Turner enjoys life in Calgary, Alberta, with his wife and 2 children. So without further ado, Chris Turner.
All right, well, thank you, Ethan. And before I go on, even though we're sort of halfway through, or getting up toward halfway through, I will take a moment to extend some of my own thanks. First of all, I should mention, you know, the text in the presentation is in French, but I will be speaking exclusively in English, for which you have my apologies and my eternal anger at the English Canadian school system, which teaches you how to conjugate verbs but not to actually converse in our other official language. And so I won't, offend you all with my accent. I'll carry on in English. I also need to thank Ethan for hosting, of course, and my two fellow presenters. I can say unequivocally, the book I wrote would not exist without their work. First of all, Katie Gibbs, who organized the protest that put this onto the public agenda. And really, I don't think any of us would have been talking about it, at least as early as we did, had she not stepped up and courageously and passionately organized that first Death of Evidence March, and then carrying on through 2013 with the Stand Up for Science marches. And then, that's it. And also, Mike Souza, as well as his colleague Margaret Moreau, who he mentioned, when you're doing a book, particularly a book like this, which is in a sense a pretty long ranting essay of a book, you need, there was not the time or the care to do my own enterprise reporting, and even if I, wanted to do that, I couldn't have done it nearly as well as Mike. Really, the backbone of the argument that I make in The War on Science is made of Mike's freedom or access to information requests, his reporting from Postmedia, and that of some of his colleagues, which took a thing that clearly this government did not want appearing in the press, and put it out there time and time again so that Canadians had a much clearer picture of what their government was up to, and I was able to put together the argument that I did. So Mike deserves a round of applause. This event, I think initially we thought maybe, a bookstore or a pub night or something like that, and all of a sudden we've got this fantastic, this is by far the fanciest venue the War on Science book tour has yet seen, by the way. And in addition to that, a fantastic team of volunteers, and I won't thank them all, but I will single out the one person who did more than anything to make this happen. So Vicki Bristow, take a bow, she was the and look like I'm really organized. So let me tell you a little bit about the War on Science. What I'm going to sort of do is in a sense, it'll be a review of what Katie and Mike talked about, and then a little bit more depth of the piecing together. It sounds, and I don't know if you found this, but when you hear all these different things, they sound like they're all over the place. It sounds like this sort of scattered array of odd government decisions, and it's really when you kind of step back like a pointillist painting and put all the dots together, you can kind of see the agenda. And so I'll lay that out, but I thought I'd begin by talking a little bit about why this matters, which sort of builds on my own work. Most of what I've done for the last 10 years has been to write about the good news, where we could get to, where this country should be going, where the whole world should be going, to deal with the defining issue of our time, climate change. And the solutions are out there, and the books are both full of them if you want to have a look, if you haven't already. There's lots in there, but really the backbone of both of those books was the idea that we had reached a place as civilizations that was unacceptable. And really when you think about it, that's sort of the history of the entire environmental movement. The whole idea of environmental stewardship is a series of moments where civilizations, societies realized this is no longer acceptable in our name. We will not permit this to carry on in our name. We cannot go forward and hand this world off to our children and grandchildren. And so I thought I'd kind of run back through those, because all of this was in the name, all the stuff that we eventually sort of drew these lines in the sand about, was in the name of progress and prosperity and jobs and growth and all of the stuff that our current federal government loves to say is their absolute top priority and the rest of it. And that really has been, where a lot of things that we look back on now as absolutely unacceptable came from. And so, just to give you an example, in the 19th century, the very early days of the environmental movement, this was an image of progress and prosperity from not far from my hometown of Calgary. What you're looking at there, if you can't tell, is an enormous mound of bison skulls. A handful, really, of the 60 million bison that we slaughtered in a few short years in the Canadian and American West in order to clear the way for progress. Bison at the time were really just getting in the way of modern agriculture, modern industry. Get them out of the way. They're just pests on the land. And in time, in part because of scenes like this, we decided as civilizations this is unacceptable. Whatever it is we're doing in the name of progress and prosperity, we cannot wantonly slaughter another species. We have to have recognize some sort of limit. And that's really where the idea of conservation came from. It was, inherently a conservative movement, of course, at the beginning. And that was that first sort of moment of awareness of what was and wasn't acceptable. And there were others along the way, of course, but one of the next critical chapters, just after World War II, was the recognition that this fantastic era of progress and prosperity that had come on the heels of fossil fuels, on the heels of the sort of better living through chemistry age, was also having unacceptable level of damage. What you're looking at here, if you don't know that scene, is the chemical DDT being sprayed on children playing at a beach. And this was absolutely a sign of progress and prosperity of its time, this miracle chemical that could eliminate these scourges, things like malaria, dengue fever that were spread by mosquitoes. But of course it took someone to step up and tell a story that the people who made the chemical didn't want told, Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, to give birth to the sort of modern environmental movement and say this is unacceptable. This is too much cost for too little benefit to a society. So that was sort of the next line in the sand. And the one that we're sort of at today, and the one where I kind of enter into this argument, is the idea that this is an image of prosperity and progress. This is fairly typical of the one of the many power plants in Alberta that keep my lights on and the rest of it. It's a coal-fired power plant, very much the engine of the modern global capitalist economy. This is the thing that we have. We were brought to this moment of advanced technology and prosperity, burning fossil fuels, and we are told we cannot continue to go forward without the burning of fossil fuels at the rate we are. And we're coming to the moment, I think, where we're fully acknowledging and accounting for the scale of the problem and saying this is unacceptable. And we're doing that because it's an even larger, it's much bigger than a pile of bison skulls. We're doing it, in fits and starts and with a lot of rancor and a lot of the confusion of our political age, I think, comes from fully acknowledging where we now have come to and where we want to go next. And of course, that's where I entered the conversation and thought, well, if we're not going to continue to do this indefinitely, what do we do next? But you can't even begin to make that kind of argument if you don't have a clear sense of where we are. And we have to be clear about where we're. This is one of the things our government is intended to do for us, is give us an accurate picture of the world we live in. Things like, what does Canada's greenhouse gas profile look like? How are we doing on greenhouse gases? This, by the way, is how we are currently doing on greenhouse gases using government data and other things. I include it mainly because the only reason Canada has made any progress whatsoever on greenhouse gases, as you can see, the dramatic drop-off of greenhouse gases in Ontario when they phased out coal. That's really the only progress. If you look at where we are, again, this is the kind of stuff we need government to be clearly articulating for us, government scientists to be gathering information, policymakers to be informed about. This is where we are as a nation right now on the defining issue of our time. Probably not a surprise to a lot of people in the room. We're not doing much other than that one coal phase out. As you can see, we're now at sort of a flat emissions profile. We have a target that a lot of climate scientists would tell you by 2020 is quite a weak one and doesn't really begin to get all the way around the problem. In any case, we have absolutely no plan to get there, and nothing that we are currently doing points to it. So really, at this moment in 2014, we as a nation have essentially decided to put on hold any serious reckoning with the defining issue of our time. And generally speaking, I was content to try and point the way to better ways of doing things until the war in science came along. And in particular, and I'll be coming back to it, the 2012 budget, the C-38 Omnibus Budget Bill, the most extraordinary budget I think any Canadian government's ever passed, the most activist budget any government's ever passed. And that inevitably led to me discovering that there was this unstated agenda that included a war on Canada's basic science. I will briefly take you through sort of a review, which Katie might have as well, of what that war looks like. I like to think of it as occurring on three fronts simultaneously. The first is the stuff that Katie talked about in depth, simply doing less science, doing less research, gathering less data, using less evidence in policy making. Basically reducing the capacity of the government to gather basic data about the status and health of the Canadian environment, particularly, as we'll see, in areas where lucrative new resource development and industrial growth are anticipated. There's any number of examples of this. Here are a handful. The long-form census, a great example of we don't think of it as a scientific document necessarily, but it is, basic numbers that, all manner of organizations, businesses, governments across the country use to make decisions about where they need to allocate their resources, that sort of thing. It's gone, of course. What you see in the top left there is the experimental lakes area, one of many government labs that was eliminated in the C-38 budget. I'll be coming back to the experimental lakes area, but suffice to say, among freshwater aquatic biologists, considered maybe the most important research facility of its type in the world. One-of-a-kind facility batted way above its weight for $2 million a year. It's gone. Banfield Marine Sciences Center in Vancouver Island, another example. It continues to function. It has some of its funding, but it has lost the capacity to support science internationally. One of the many ways that we have abandoned the international scientific community through this series of cuts. So that's the first piece of the war. The first front is simply doing less science. The second front involves what we do with that basic science once we gather it. And we're doing a lot less of that as well. We're doing less analysis, we're consulting fewer experts, and we're formulating inherently bad policy. This is a government really that does not seem to trust expertise of any sort, whether it's a crime bill, whether it's a health bill, whether it's environmental science. If someone shows up with a PhD and a long history of looking at that specific thing, they are not to be trusted on that subject. They might tell you something you don't want to hear. Again, I could show you a long list of the sort of things that have been eliminated and reduced in capacity as a result of this. The National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy is a great example of an organization within government that was basically bringing together the right kind of stakeholders to tell the government, based on the best available evidence, both from environmental science and from economics and from industry, what things like climate change meant for Canada. It was eliminated in the typically glib style of this government with Peter Kent's reference to the fact that that was a pre-internet organization. We don't need that information, we can get it ourselves. From Google, allegedly. Great example of the way that this government consults experts. Top right there you see doctors who provide refugee health care demonstrating the only way they could get a hearing on the cut to the funding that allowed them to continue their work, which was to protest in their lab coats, much as Katie and her colleagues did over the cuts in Bill C-38. The refugee health care bill, widely opposed by there's many of these, but widely opposed by just about everyone who had any direct knowledge of what that funding did, and of course they were routinely glibly dismissed. And then you also see here the Joint Review Panel hearings for the Northern Gateway Pipeline. Just one of many things like this where the basic research that government uses then forms the backbone of policymaking. The Joint Review Panel is supposed to determine for Canadians what is the full cost of approving a pipeline of that sort across northern British Columbia. The Department of Fisheries, before the Joint Review Panel finished its deliberations, told them, we simply don't have the institutional capacity anymore to deliver a full environmental impact assessment before you reach your verdict. So the Joint Review Panel went ahead without the best available evidence. Among other things, we hadn't figured out what bitumen does when it spills in cold water before we went and approved the pipeline or recommended approval of the pipeline. So there's another way we're doing less science. And then the third, which is what Mike talked about a lot more, is the muzzling of scientists, the actual control of how scientists talked about message discipline, media control, muzzled scientists. In some cases direct, in some cases simply the increasing chill around the idea that if you say anything, speak out as someone in government, you're liable to probably run into trouble from your minders. Again, all manner of examples, and Katie ran through some of these, and Mike did as well. But in addition to the direct cases, the Professional Institute of Public Service of Canada published a study last October where they surveyed the government scientists in their membership, and two remarkable numbers in a report full of them. 37% of federal scientists said they'd been blocked recently from speaking with the media or the public at some point. So nearly, more than a third. And even more alarming, 1 in 4, 25% said they'd omitted or altered information in their reports for non-scientific reasons. So 1 in 4 said that work that they were doing in the public interest had been changed for reasons that were not scientific, largely, of course, to fit the policy of the day. So that is the war on science. That is the three fronts on which it occurs. If you need a shorthand version, you can think of these three guys reconfigured. Do no science, hear no science, speak no science. Again, Not across the board. I should qualify myself. I should give the government its due. It's not that they're doing no science. And I've actually been talking about this book enough in the media and beyond. I now know the government's talking points, so I'll give them to you just so you have them. The first is, this government actually is spending more money. And this government doesn't usually brag about spending public money, but they are spending more money on science than any previous Canadian government. Which is true if you don't adjust for inflation, which usually you do when you're comparing numbers across time. If you compare across, if you adjust for inflation, they are spending less money, and as Katie demonstrated, the way they are spending it is the big problem. They are moving away from pure research in the public interest toward, science that can demonstrate obvious near-term business application of some sort. So that's one of their talking points. The other thing this government likes to do when confronted with a point that it can't rebut is to give you numbers to sort of bewilder you. So they will quote the thousands. This is how many requests we've gotten for media interviews as a government in the last year or so. Here's how many we've honored. So clearly we are not stopping everyone from talking. And I think as Mike hopefully demonstrated, it's not that they're stopping everyone from talking. It's who is not being permitted to talk and why. And that's really the part that I worry about the most. And the third thing they will tell you is that lots of the stuff that government was doing really shouldn't even be government science. We have universities and research labs outside of government to do that. Probably to date, the high point of the sort of media and publicity I've done around this tour was I was on The Current, which is the CBC morning program, which is great in itself. But I wasn't actually debating this guy who was a conservative spokesperson for a think tank, not actually in the government, but he was repeating the government line. In any case, I would talk and then he would talk, and it was sort of like a debate, but not really. And at one point, to rebut my point, he said, sure, if you talk to the malcontents who lost their jobs in government, you'll hear that there's a war on science. But talk to brain researchers at Dalhousie University who are doing wonderful under this government. And that was his example, brain researchers at Dal. And 2 days later, I got an email from the producer at CBC with an attachment that was a letter signed by 21 brain researchers at Dalhousie University, clearly stating that no, in fact, they were not doing better under this government. In fact, they were finding hard access to research to carry on the funding to carry on the research, et cetera, et cetera. So really great sort of pat on the back. I won't go through the whole list of what we have lost already in this war, but just a random greatest hits, everything from the long-form census to the Kyoto Accord to the fact that we are the only country in the UN that has not signed the Convention to Combat Desertification, everything from the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Science to the Department of Fisheries Habitat Management Program, which is massively reduced in size, the fisheries libraries that Katie showed you the pictures of being closed with no real thought or care, and on and on and on. And so then the question becomes, the important question becomes, as Canadians, why would this government do what it's doing? What's the, if not what they claim, which is that we're spending more money than ever, what is the motivation? What is the agenda at work here? And so let's go back to the clearest articulation of this government's agenda, which I believe was that 2012 omnibus budget bill. It was the first majority government budget. It was an extraordinarily long, detailed, in-depth document. As many of you probably saw in the news, the gentleman who brought it to government has retired today from the job, so not so sad to see him go, to be honest. In any case, in addition to the massive cuts, all of which were under the smoke screen of tight belt tightening and tough times and the rest of it, this was a bill that amended, repealed, or altered almost 70 pieces of legislation. It rewrote the Fisheries Act to leave 80% of endangered species unprotected. It rewrote the Navigable Waters Act to reduce the number of protected bodies of water across Canada from millions to a few dozen. It was an extraordinarily activist, powerful statement of purpose. And of course, this government doesn't say why it's doing what it's doing very often to Canadians. But sometimes something sneaks out when someone's outside Canada and they think maybe nobody's listening. So actually the most clear articulation, I believe, of this government's agenda was Christopher Plunkett, who was the government spokesman in Washington, talking to the Washington Post right at the time that bill was tabled. And he said, very, very clearly, the idea is simple and straightforward: to make Canada the most attractive country in the world for resource investment and development. That is the purpose of that bill and the agenda of this government. That is, aside from maintaining and consolidating their own power, their absolute highest goal, which is to make Canada the most attractive country in the world for resource investment and development. By the way, Plunkett did go on to say, and enhance our world-class protection of the environment today for future generations of Canadians. And I bet he has that, written on his wall, so that he says it after anything that he actually means, in order to give you the window dressing of continuity with what Canada has been doing for the last 100 years when we developed world-class environmental stewardship, world-class government research in the public interest, all the stuff that was being cut, even as Plunkett was saying, and that's why we're doing it. So let's go back. I won't spend too much time there because I don't want to take. I'd like to get to the panel part of the day, but I will take you through the Canadian science tradition just so that we are clear. We're not talking about the difference from one government to the next. We're talking about a break with really the whole tradition of Canadian science as long as we've been a country and beyond. If you look at when did Canada start getting serious about science, it began more or less in the 1820s with a wave of Scottish immigration and then another. The reason for this was that Scotland at the time had the world's leading natural science research institutions, universities like Edinburgh and Glasgow. At the time, Oxford and Cambridge and some of the great English universities still very much focused on the classics, whereas the Scots were really some of the world's best scientists at the time, and people like Sir Sandford Fleming, for example, who came to Canada, helped found the Royal Canadian Institute, one of the first big science bodies in Canada, and used it as a vehicle to introduce standard time to the world. Alongside that, we saw the Geological Survey of Canada, which in the process of finding natural resources also became one of the founding bodies of paleontology, and on and on and on. All of this through the 1800s into the early 1900s, the first meteorological and marine research stations set up as well. The first great champion of public science was a gentleman widely considered to be maybe the most boring prime minister in Canadian history, Sir Robert Gordon. He himself believed himself to be quite a dull guy. He actually called his own appointment to the head of the Conservative Party at the time an absurdity for the party and madness for me. He felt that, I'm not supposed to be in charge. But Gordon at the time was just what the country needed, because we'd come through this era of extraordinary sort of corruption and petty cronyism. The civil service was basically just handouts for the government of the day, basically give the reward to the most loyal supporters. Gordon, starting in 1911, came in with the idea, the sort of classic reform idea, that what we needed was a civil service that existed at arm's length from the government. These people were professionals who were the best at their job, and they would give us the best possible information and evidence to do what it is that we need them to do. And so under Gordon, we saw things like the Central Experimental Farm outside of Ottawa, which is where we developed the strain of wheat that made us one of the world's great bread baskets, the National Research Council, which was initially a wartime industrial development and research and technological research body, all of this. And then in 1918, the Civil Service Act, in which Gordon sort of encoded the idea that the civil service needs to be this body of parts. And although governments of the day have wavered on their interest in the science being done, really right down to very recently, even conservative governments embraced this tradition that grew out of these arm's length bodies. And in fact, a lot of us as Canadians, I think pretty centrally of our identity as being, proud environmental stewards, world leaders on things like acid rain and the ozone layer. And that really comes from these arm's length bodies that were set up that even under the last Conservative government of Brian Mulroney were absolutely leading the global conversation on environmental action. In fact, one of the big surprises I found in researching this book was that I liked Brian Mulroney a lot more than I thought I did. Now, I should add, part of the reason I like Brian Mulroney so much is that he had a really fantastic environment ministry with a senior advisor by the name of Elizabeth May in it, who was doing some very good work. But in any case, that was the kind of approach we took as recently as the last Conservative government. The idea that you would, even when it came to climate change, which we knew very little about at the time, you got the best minds into the room. I spoke to a climate scientist by the name of John Stone, who set up the climate modeling group at Environment Canada. And he talked about going to the 1990 climate talks in Geneva, the ones that led to the Rio summit. And he describes it, he says, it was mixed and it was very open. I remember sitting around the big table at our embassy where the meeting was being held in Geneva, and these members of parliament from different parties quite openly discussing Canadian positions and things like that. So, we might fight in parliament, but the idea was when you went off to take Canada's stand on the defining issue of our time, bring the best people along, get a diversity of opinion. Of course, it's very, very different today, and I'll come around to that. I should mention, though, that this war on science didn't come entirely out of nowhere. It sort of came, there was sort of what I think of as the sneak preview of it. In the collapse of one of the most glorious natural bounties in the Earth's history, the classic cod fishery, which I would argue the Conservative government took the current Conservative government took all the wrong lessons from. I won't go into the detail of it. I'm sure most of you have heard the mythology of the Grand Banks, that you could practically walk across them because there was so much fish in the water. As recently as the 1970s, Canadian government spokespeople would say things like, we couldn't possibly deplete this catch unless nature reversed itself. That was how bounteous it seemed to be. But of course, we moved to a whole other scale of fishing. The first 250 years of the cod fishery, from 1500 to 1750, we caught as much as we caught between 1960 and 1975. So 15 years of large-scale fishing did 250 years worth of previous fishing. And this led to, as we learned after the fact, the increasing notice of certain kinds of Canadian government scientists, mostly working in the Department of Fisheries, that in fact the stocks didn't seem to be as strong as we thought they were. And there was evidence emerging into the 1980s that this was not looking like it was a sustainable level of fishing. And one of the things, and this is that had happened along the way, was that what had formerly been arm's length research bodies, like the body that led to the creation of experimental lakes area, got kind of mashed into the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And what that meant was that you had scientists doing the work and bureaucrats kind of massaging it before it went to the ministry level. And that's what happened in the discussion around the 1991 cod quota. There was a conservation scenario on the table, the one the scientists that were endorsing as the one that would be the best for the long-term health of the fishery, of 100,000 tons. The previous year, 200,000 tons had been the quota. No fisheries minister who wanted to keep his job wanted to be in charge of cutting the quota in half. So when it was presented to the ministry, they discarded the lowball scenario, 100,000, and then they looked at the impact of 150,000 and 170,000 versus the status quo, and basically wound up splitting the difference to 190,000, and thereby ushered in the final collapse of Canada's cod fishery by massively overdoing the final quota. The lesson of this should have been, whatever you're going to do with the government of the day, get the science right. If there is evidence in your department that you need to be doing something to keep this thing going, bite the bullet, take a look at the real evidence. Of course, the lesson that the current government seems to have learned is that what you should do is, if there are these bodies that keep coming up with evidence you don't like, get rid of them. Experimental lakes area is a great example of that. Just briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, 58 lakes in northern Ontario, very much a lab as a living environment in which you could do ecosystem level experiments to figure out things like, what happens when you add a whole bunch of phosphorus to a lake, as we were doing with industrial activity in the 1960s. What happens when all of the pollutants that we were emitting through coal chimneys come